Boundaries have been coming up a lot in my practice lately and with my clients. And I think it's something that is always there, but I'm a little bit more aware of it lately. But I think it's something that when we recognize that's sort of what the problem is, we recognize that we're allowing people to take advantage of us, or we're not saying no to the things that we need to be saying no to, or stretching ourselves too far, or we recognize that there's some way that we're allowing ourselves to be unhappy and we're not holding kind of appropriate boundaries and lines with people, and we recognize that, okay, that's part of the problem. But then how do we actually set those boundaries? And when we think about it, like, what actually are boundaries? Like, what does that look like? All of those questions I think are kind of hard, and it makes boundaries a little bit elusive, even though we all know what the word boundary means, right? But it's really helpful to get into what boundaries actually are and the different types of boundaries that there are. So this is a great check-in that you can do. So this video, I'm going to go through the types of boundaries and walk you through kind of a check-in on where you're at with all the different types. And then you can kind of evaluate, okay, here I'm doing pretty well, here I'm a little bit too rigid, here I'm a little bit too porous and I give too much, and we can kind of evaluate that. So I'll walk you through that in this video. And then I'm also gonna do another video that kind of walks you through even more kind of how-tos and some tips and kind of some things that can help you on the journey to kind of implementing how to set boundaries for yourself. So as we go through this, I wanna look at boundaries kind of in a scale. So on one end of the scale is really rigid boundaries. The middle is more healthy boundaries, and then the far other end is kind of porous boundaries. So rigid, you don't give enough, and porous, you give too much, and sort of the healthy in between is kind of the middle. So as we go through this, we'll kind of talk about that. And I'll give you some examples of how in the past maybe I was too rigid or too porous in some of these. So think about that as we go through these, and we can kind of rate them. So the first kind of type of boundary is physical boundaries. So physical boundaries are kind of our personal space and physical touch. So where we all are different in kind of what we want and what we're comfortable with that, we need to be aware of that. And really healthy boundaries here would be being really aware of what you like and also others' personal space. So people who tend to like overly hug and touch people that don't really want to be hugged and touched, that would be someone that has a little bit of a porous boundary there. And people who don't really want that at all and never give that maybe are a little bit more porous, but maybe that works for them, so maybe that's not really a problem. I did the love language tests with my family, my siblings and my parents once, and I score pretty high on physical touch as kind of one of my love languages. And my brother, who's now a teenager now, scores very low. He has a big personal space bubble. He doesn't like to be touched. So he hates it when everyone's like hugging him, and even like, he just doesn't like any kind of touch. Even like a pat on the back sometimes is a little too much for him. But I thought it was really cute once. We were in the kitchen and he came over and he just put his hand on my shoulder, like kind of awkwardly, just like, and I'm like, what are you doing? He said, well, I know you like physical touch, so I'm trying to, offer this in the way that I can, which was so funny. I think at the time he was younger, he was like 11 maybe, but he recognized that my sort of boundary and my need was different than his, so he found kind of a way to meet it in the middle, which I think that's an example of really healthy boundaries, right? Looking at, this is how I am, this is how they are, how do I work this out in the middle? So that's kind of something to be aware of and kind of rate where you are there. So yes, that's one kind of category and something that's helpful to look at. The next one is intellectual boundaries. So those are like thoughts and ideas. Violating those boundaries would be when people belittle you or your thoughts and your ideas. They kind of put you down. They maybe overly criticize. That's someone who pushes that a little bit too much. So you could probably think of a time where you felt that, where someone was just kind of overly critical and belittled you in that way, and that's obviously not a healthy boundary. And how much you allow that or not will show where you are on the scale. So do you just allow people to say whatever they want and totally belittle your ideas? Or are you on the other end where you shut it down and maybe you're overly kind of sensitive and critical and you shut it down before it even gets there? So a nice in between would be that you stand up for yourself when someone crosses that line and that boundary, but you also kind of are open for conversation and flexibility and that kind of thing. And kind of similarly, our emotional boundaries. So violation of emotional boundaries is similar in that that's when someone is criticizing your emotions or invalidating you or being, really negative and kind of belittles how you're feeling. That obviously never feels good, right? So if someone's doing that, how do you react? Do you just let people do that all the time? And obviously that ends up negatively impacting you. Where does your kind of boundary lie within emotional boundaries? I think that's something good to think about. And another thing here is that people who are more manipulative and unhealthy are really good at pushing that boundary and making you feel like it's your fault. Like they wouldn't do that if you weren't that stupid or if you weren't, making them do it. They're really good at making that seem like that's your fault when that's not true and that's not healthy. But really unhealthy, manipulative people will push your boundaries and make it seem like it's your fault. So that's also something to be aware of. Maybe you have really poor boundaries and really porous boundaries, and maybe that's because you were raised by someone who always did that, who always belittled you and always made you feel bad. Or maybe that's the kind of relationships that you've had and you've sort of been shown that you don't matter and that you can't sort of have boundaries because ... So there's a lot of kind of underlying stuff that goes into how we got here in our boundaries as well that I think is helpful to recognize and look at, because we learned what was okay and what was not okay probably a long time ago. You learned what you would put up with, what was okay to put up with and what wasn't a long time ago. So that's something to kind of recognize. I was gonna say something else there. It'll come back to me. Anyway, the next one is sexual boundaries. So sexual boundaries they can kind of also tie in some emotional boundaries, physical boundaries, anything that kind of has to do with sex and sexuality. So how much does someone push that or not? A really healthy way would be that, you respect each other, you respect each other's desires, you respect each other's limitations, and a violation of that would be pushing that in any way. And I think there's a lot of problems with this one in particular because a lot of times we're raising women to accept men that push that's okay. And I've heard that kind of thing a lot, that men are always going to push that and keep pushing that, and that you kind of just are supposed to accept that that's how they are, which I think is really unhealthy because it sets women up not only to accept their boundary being pushed more than they should or more than maybe feels good for them, and also we don't teach girls to stand up for themselves enough. So if you're standing up for yourself or you're holding hard lines, and you're looked down upon or you're called a bitch, or it's just really not taught in a healthy way. So that is a lot of times here when we really examine this, that the things that we've been taught, the way we've been raised, kind of societal expectations have played into all of this and maybe have made us put up with more than, if we really look at it, more than we actually want to put up with and more than feels good for us. And that's why it's so important to look at this, because if we look at this, we can say, all right, these are kind of the expectations that I was raised with. This is sort of why I've got here. This is kind of some trauma that's impacted me here. This is some negative relationships that's impacted me, and it's ended me up here, maybe too rigid or too porous in this boundary, and that's not working for me anymore. So how can I better set myself up to feel good and to hold lines that feel better for me? And maybe that's leaning in and being a little more vulnerable sometimes, and maybe sometimes that's setting more of a line and not accepting some behavior. So this is a really, really important thing to look at. And again, the next video we'll go in more into the how-tos, But for now, I want you to just examine these different boundaries and see where you could use some more work and maybe examination. So another one is material boundaries. And this refers to like money and possessions and sort of our things that we have. And I kind of like the example that you may like lend more to your family than you would to people that you don't know, right? Which is healthy. Like, I'm gonna lend my car to my sister, but I wouldn't just lend it to somebody I just met, right? But different societies and different families sort of have different expectations for how much you do that or not. And sometimes those don't work for you. So I've been in situations where the expectation was that you shared everything and that you gave everything. And sometimes that didn't work for me because often I wouldn't get that thing back, or it would come back really damaged, or it just didn't feel right for me, but I felt like there was pressure to do that. So holding more of a boundary there and being like, you know what, like, I appreciate you and I want to help out, but I can't do that in this way. Like, maybe I can help out with this. You know, so I had to kind of find ways to go around that in a way that felt good for me and still maintain that relationship. And people aren't always going to like that, right? That's the thing with boundaries. When you set them, a lot of times people will be angry or they'll be reactive, and that's sort of a part of this. And it's not a fun part of it, of course, but it is a part of it. So that's kind of part of it, is learning to set the boundary and be okay with some negative reactions, because that will happen. So that's kind of that. Obviously, pushing a material boundary would be people, invading that, maybe taking more than you allow them to take. It could also be like invading your space, like invading your room or your house, or going through your computer or something. It could kind of be that too. So just a violation of sort of the things that are yours. So kind of look at that and think about that. So the last area is time boundaries. So how much do people push and demand your time? So this is one that I probably has been hardest for me more in the last couple of years. I've kind of got more of the other ones down as the years have progressed, but time has been one that's been difficult, especially because I work with clients a lot and I want to help them and I want to give my time. And sometimes I used to get into these situations where I would end up spending a lot more time than I planned with a client, or on a particular case or on a call or something, and then I would end up feeling just bad about it, or I'd end up throwing off my whole schedule, or I just wouldn't get all the things done that I needed to get done. And then if you keep allowing that to happen, you start to build resentment, and that's not fair, right? That person didn't know usually, and so now you're building resentment for them, or you have to like be a little bit more rigid to not let that happen again because you're totally off schedule. So I just recognized that wasn't healthy, and I can want to help people and still have boundaries, right? So that's the thing to all of these. I want to help you and I want to be on a call with you, and this is the amount of time that I have to offer. And not going over that doesn't mean that I don't care. It means that I have a schedule, and this is my boundary, and this is what's healthy for me, right? So I think that's something that I had to really work on and still have to work on sometimes. And I think a lot of these are harder when you're in kind of a giving profession, or you're a mom, or you're doing something where it's almost required and expected for you to give a lot more. So then when you're in that position, it's hard to know how and when to draw the lines, and how and when to hold boundaries and still let people know that you care about them and that sort of thing. So look at that and kind of look at, are people demanding too much of your time? In any of these also, are you pushing too much? Are you demanding too much of other people's time? And kind of evaluate that and see if there's some ways that you can sort of make some adjustments there. So those are the type of boundaries: physical, intellectual, emotional, sexual, material, and time. Look at those for yourself and evaluate them. So I just made like little notes here, and I wrote on the top like H for healthy, R for rigid, H for porous, H for healthy, P for porous. So look at that. I have a worksheet too that I can send you. You're welcome to write it down like I did, but if you don't want to do that, I can also send you a worksheet that's a little more kind of formal way to do this. But write down for each where you're at now. It's also kind of helpful to look back on where you were if those have changed. Like emotional boundaries. I used to be more rigid, so now I'm more healthy, but it's still at times hard for me to lean in and share a lot of information. But in the past, I was a lot more rigid, so I wouldn't share hardly anything. And that's not healthy either. That's not how we connect with people, right? So we have to know what to share and how to share on how we're feeling and what we're thinking and that sort of thing. But it's helpful to, I think, look at if these have changed, how have they changed? So I used to be more rigid, maybe in emotional and intellectual boundaries, and now I'm in more of a healthy place where I can know when to share and I can lean into kind of being vulnerable and sharing in that way. So check that out, evaluate it, see what you come up with, kind of see what comes up for you. Again, I'll send you the worksheet if you want that. There's also some kind of questions to sort of prompt some reflection and some processing at the end of that. If you want that, check that out. And then also check out the next video, and we'll keep adding on and building and see kind of how we can change these boundaries. So we've identified now maybe areas that we need to work on, and now let's get into how we start doing that and the kind of more of the in-depth how-tos on how to do that. So check out that one for help on that. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe so you don't miss anything, and make sure you click the little bell notification thing so you get notified when new videos come out. All right, thank you guys.